Enduring, life-giving, noble, the tree. Witness to our kinship with the world of myth and mystery, of sun and wind and water, delicate, fragile at times, vulnerable always to our need and greed. The tree of life, and wood, a substance with a soul.
Not everyone feels the same way about wood as I do. When I was living in the high Arctic, working with the Eskimo people there, they felt a great mistrust of wood. They didn't like it at all. They lived in a land without any trees. And on the few occasions when we did go down to the tree line by dog team, they were afraid to live in the trees. They said they whispered like ghosts. When I went to Tokyo to work with a great printmaster, Unichi Hiratsuka, he had altogether different feelings. He revered the three great woods of Japan, Ho, Katsura, and cherry, and especially cherry. That was the material he wanted to use to cut his gorgeous wood blocks. I tried as hard as I could to learn the techniques of Japan so that I could take them back to the Eskimo world with me, so that they might be some use to the Eskimo people. But of course, when I got there, I found that they still had their same mistrust of wood. For them, they wanted to think of stone, the beautiful stone that they find for carving. And when they did think about a material a little bit like wood, they thought in terms of walrus ivory or caribou antler or whalebone. Those were the materials that were important. Well, that's the subject of another program. Perhaps in your world, as well as mine, wood is a very important material. It is said that every North American red-blooded man is a woodworking nut. He runs the gamut from the small boy rattling his stick along a picket fence to the innumerable amateurs who whittle away for their own joy and satisfaction, to the professional artist for whom woodwork is a vocation and whose work is sometimes a revelation.
Like Stephen Hogbin of Owen Sound, Ontario, a major Canadian artist. Originally from the world of industrial design, he now creates objects of beauty and utility from this, the most human of materials.
The designer for industry, I think, is often making anonymous objects, that they don't have the same sort of emotional content that a handmade or craft object can have. So there are, I think, very important connections there that we've lost now, and that's one reason why so many people are getting back at the business of crafts as makers and as well as consumers, because there is that connection that can be made with the person who created the object. So that's working at one level. I think it's very important. I think there are other levels where it's perhaps more difficult to talk about it, and that's the emotional quality that's put into a piece. It may be that the object has some sort of ritual quality to it that just can't be present in an industrially produced object.
The cup from which you drink, the chalice with which you celebrate. The function facilitates the occasion. The form enriches it. The hand and the eye engaged in their ancient dialogue. The chalice they create suggesting some ancient ritual, and fittingly made of wood. Transformed, it yet preserves its integrity. A wooden form of silky brown Queensland oak rises up to hold an egg for breakfast, the ritual celebration of a new day. Stephen Hogbin shares with his colleague and friend Donald McKinley the conviction that for the right object, there's always the right wood. Like the marvelous Huon pine of Tasmania, 5,000 years old, from which both men create objects that are somehow not only an expression of their vision of life, but of the life once enshrined in that wood.
If we open these up like a book,
Professor of the Sheridan School of Design in Toronto and a fine original artist, McKinley selects his wood with infinite care and patience. For him, the board is sometimes a revelation. It can contain worlds.
with wood, it's not going to get any harder, it's not going to get any softer. You know, it has resistance when you pick it up as a raw material. And that, you know, if it has a lot of resistance, that is, it's a difficult task to alter the shape of this board instead of that board, that in use, this board is going to maintain its form better. It's going to resist knocks and abrasion and so forth. So that, you know, that there's a direct connection between the way the material is when you're working it and the way it is when it's paying you back as a finished object. And I think that that kind of reliability, that what you see is what you've got, is a piece of why I like woodworking, and I think why other people do.
From the tree through the board to the finished object. Here, within a multiplicity of shapes, McKinley somehow still suggests the original outline of the board, the flow of line, the subtle variation of rhythm, harmonizing with the color and the function of the wood.
So, you know, I think that the woodworking thing is we're just ready for what wood can do for us in a kind of a human way. That's one of the reasons for the increased interest now.
Certain people have a natural affinity, a mystical identity with wood. The northern races, the Indians of the Pacific Northwest, and of course, the Japanese. On his property near New Hope, Pennsylvania, an American-Japanese furniture maker, George Nakashima, an artist of international reputation, surrounds himself with rare and beautiful trees from all over the world. The glory and mystery of the forest and his own strong sense of man's affinity with nature have shaped his vision of life.
I think actually a tree is more godlike than man. If you think about it, there would be no man without a tree. And when you think of trees, they are godlike. They do nothing but good. Whereas you can't say that about the human race and the human being. I can wander off in the woods by myself for days at a time and be quite happy. And my only relationships are with trees and perhaps a few animals. So there is that feeling of a soul, and I think that the trees definitely do have a soul. They also have a life that terminates, just like the human beings do, and like the soul does, actually. I think this all started when I was a youth in the Pacific Northwest. I used to hike up and down Limping Mountains. I remember quite often I used to go into the rainforest in the Hoh River Valley, where the great trees are there, in the forest. It's one of the real fine forests in the world, is the Olympic Peninsula there. And I think it's probably also racial. I've always been interested in trees. And then, since being in this business, I've taken more of a direct approach to it. A tree obviously dies sooner or later. Actually, if it's not used and used properly, it turns to dust again, and there's nothing there. But I find cutting a tree into boards, for instance, that each board comes out with a certain type of life. And it's up to me and whoever's interested to discover this life and to translate it into something that's useful to man. Around here, huh? I think, isn't it a little high here, too? Yeah.
Flat.
Mm-hmm.
If you go on a diagonal over here,
Yeah, there's a high
you
point
have to
there.
get
Yeah.
this corner and this corner here.
Yeah.
Probably all, this whole area right in here.
Yeah.
But the mystic is also a businessman. To choose the right piece of wood may be an artistic decision, but there is also the need to create something useful. Every Saturday of the year, people from all over North America come to see George Nakashima in his famous conoid studio. And here they talk.
15 inches wide.
What kind of wood does the client want?
The wood I'd like would not be too dark.
What is the setting
table
in
is,
which the piece is to be
in
placed?
hall, rather narrow hall. Under
How will it
very
be
large
used?
Contemporary painting.
And indeed, how do you reconcile your belief in the soul of a tree with a commission for a table and a set of chairs? Created for Nelson Rockefeller. The Japanese influence again. The painter puts down on canvas the human face with its lines and furrows, its marks of living and dying. In the same way, Nakashima lets the tree in death speak for itself. Is this the back of the moon, or something that once lived and perhaps still does? Given a Second Life by George Nakashima. And then there are those who don't want you to know that it's wood at all. A trick of the eye, the visual joke, a new use for wood. One which the most fascinating and original furniture maker in the United States today, Wendell Castle, has virtually rediscovered. Everything you see here is wood. You can't pick it up and put it on, but you can feel it, you can touch it, you can almost smell it.
A model for a drawing class that I was supposed to be teaching didn't show up, or was late, I forget which, but I had to come up with something quickly. And I just took off my sport coat and hung it over the back of the chair that was there and said, okay, draw the chair with the sport coat hanging over it. And it was kind of a slow day, so I drew it too. And looking at those drawings later and having done it quickly, I didn't make any difference in texture between the coat and the chair. So it all looked like one thing. And it just seemed to me that in that drawing that it seemed like a wooden coat. In the trompe-l'oeil work, to me, those pieces of furniture were very obviously pieces of furniture, with no attempt to make them like sculpture. It was only the addition of this extra thing that took them away from furniture, but yet by the critics in the art world and readily and almost universally treated that as sculpture. And to me, that appeared much more like furniture than the furniture I'd been doing earlier. So, I came to the conclusion, none of this really mattered. What it actually appears like has nothing to do with what it's accepted as. So it sort of made it easier for me then to go into making a piece of furniture that might appear more traditional. Whereas, say, 10 years ago, I would have thought that would have been like the kiss of death when I was trying to get a reputation as an artist. And if I made a traditional piece of furniture, I would just be categorized as a cabinet maker.
Is this furniture or sculpture? Or the one masquerading as the other? A staircase sculpted, and yet both functional and ornamental. Yet instinctively he knew that furniture can have a strong emotional impact.
The work has to have a lot of presence. It has to be powerful. And in many cases, it's even frightening and intimidating to people. And those are things that are important to art. And you can put those into furniture.
Man the maker has always known this, or at least sensed it. Power in this chief's throne from West Africa. Glory in this lion-footed chair from the tomb of King Tut. And today, too, big business has its own unique version.
But the chairman of the board now, the chairman of the board, the man with the chair, He's the leader, the chairman of the board. And compare his chair with the 15th secretary down the line. You know, and here's this little pad that she's perched on. She, right? You know, only she would put up with this. And no wonder they're getting damn mad. You know, meanwhile, the chairman of the board is luxuriating, you know, in this object with all these adjustments and that much foam and so forth, and that keeps him a comfortable distance from the work.
All variations on a theme. What does wood tell us?
Did you consider the laminating two pieces together on the 45 and it would have fallen?
But how do we learn?
On your front line and become
How do we discover? The school which Castle runs in Scottsville, New York, reflects his discovery, or rather rediscovery, that craftsmanship can be art on a very high level.
You know, the plain back legs are a carryover from the time when all chairs sat against the wall. That's very 17th century Dutch Baroque.
And then
The value of working with young people, the stimulus of conveying and sharing your ideas with others. What do you look for in furniture?
Right, well, as part of the versatility feature that was in...
How does it feel when you sit in a particular chair?
The school is in an effort to try to teach a program that really has a sound basis in what I think are the important building blocks to a career in designing and making furniture. That is understanding and being able to do the technical things that are necessary, say cutting joints and understanding the use of the tools, understanding construction, and then being able to draw and visualize things accurately and quickly, putting those together in a program that's very disciplined and organized to try to accomplish this in a relatively short period of time.
The eye and the hand and the wood it carves. The celebration of the natural world, flowers and fruit, in wood, done in decorative inlay, marquetry, another skill to be drawn on from the past.
It's often written that late 17th and 18th century furniture is the finest furniture that was ever made. Now, I never quite understood that comment. It seemed to me, how could that be? Nowadays, with much better tools and better materials, why aren't people making better furniture now? But in looking at those pieces, I decided that that statement was true. And that's the kind of thing I'm trying to make happen here.
From traditional beginnings through various bizarre and experimental variations, and finally back to the traditional again. It is a journey that many artists in this century have made, and it leads not only to a re-examination of their own relationships with the past, but also with the nature of the material itself.
The technical virtuosity demanded in the current pieces is rather extreme and unappreciated in some cases because some of it becomes totally hidden when the piece is finished. Some great effort that you went to achieve some kind of effect and then is totally closed up. And then the other is in the form, in decorating and in using color and fancy woods. It's just, you know, an extreme. I do believe whatever direction you're going to go in, you go all the way. There's a certain approach to woodworking where the piece of wood has a say in what it should be. and that it tells the artist, in turn, how it should be treated. Now, I don't feel that way at all, and I'm frequently criticized for that, but because of whatever idea I want to happen, I make it happen on the piece of wood. I'll find a piece of wood I think is suitable, and that the grain is going right, and so on, the color is right, but I don't get ideas from pieces of wood.
In Owen Sound, Stephen Hogben, the finest wood turner in the country, has taken a different journey. Not for him the mystical world of Nakashima or Wendell Castle's new forms based on the classical past, but still the promise of new beginnings.
This may be the last piece I ever turn. I find there's not so much excitement in it because I've discovered most of the relationships. Because of my temperament, because of the way I look at things, I started discovering some relationships that hadn't really been discovered before, I think. And so I explored those possibilities, and the more I explored it, the more exciting it became. But it was always centered on the wood turning.
What of this unique and beautiful material? How do we value it? Here is an answer, a candy apple stick made of Australian jarrah wood. One man's protest against the throwaway culture. Apples. Candy apples. And candy apple sticks. Waste. What happens to us when we continually discard things? So Stephen Hogben made a different kind of stick. One you keep and use again and again.
Well, the thing is that maybe a $5 candy apple stick is not unreasonable if the alternative is that, you know, there's a forest of slain trees, you know, that produced the ones that had no merit and no importance and no identity, and that a person couldn't connect with except it being a means to an end. It's the way to keep your hand from getting sticky and the apple in your mouth, you know, and that we just take for granted the fact that here's this extension of an apple. And no, you don't eat it, you know, you carry it in your hand. But that incidentally, when you're through with the apple, my God, isn't this a nice thing? He's a thing maker, you know, and they affect us.
The craftsman's shop. Gregory Brown was once a prospector. Now he plays the flute, builds elegant cabinets, and restores 18th century furniture. He uses rare wood brought from all over the world, which he savors like some connoisseur tasting a delicate wine. The dream of the past and the tools of the present. A romantic craftsman whose longings are at last realized in the sculptured lines of a wooden boat.
But I wanted to produce something that was very graceful and elegant, something that, for example, a 19th century gentleman would take his lady out rowing in, you see. The thing that appeals to me mostly about this boat is that it's the closest thing a craftsman can come to sort of doing what an artist does when he creates a sculpture, in the sense that it's very three-dimensional in shape, in so much as that everything is curved. There's not a single straight line in the whole thing. And even more appealing to me is that this is really a function of necessity. Or it's something that had to be that way, like the beautiful swan-like shape of this hull is actually a result of 19th century technology sort of dealing with the whole business of how to move this boat through the water as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Sure looks good, doesn't it? The beauty of this craft is that she's made of wood. The planking is BC red cedar, it's quarter sawn, edge grain, and it doesn't move too much with taking on water. The ribs are lovely Vancouver Island Gary oak, and they create a lovely yellow effect, an amber effect. The seats are made out of Honduras mahogany, which give it that lovely warm tone, and they're inlaid with this black line of ebony. The side panels are done in cane to give it that 19th century flavor. The floorboards also are Honduras mahogany, which have a lovely grain. They're book matched on either side, which essentially the board has been sawn open to create the same grain patterns on each side of the craft. And these little ivory toggles that you see are actually made of whale's tooth ivory. The knees on the seats here are Vancouver Island juniper root, and they've been carefully chosen so the grain of the wood follows the curve of this knee, which gives a maximum amount of strength. This bit of wood here is made of lignum vitae, which comes from South America, and it has natural waxes and oils in it, which gives natural lubricating properties to the oarlocks. The seats are supported by these very pretty little classical pillars. That's a result of my furniture training. Essentially, the inside of this boat is fitted out like a piece of furniture, which is not something you normally see.
Every cubic inch is thought about. Thousands of pieces of wood assembled, intricately worked and fitted together. A woodworker's pride, an interior designer's delight. Ah, what a sweet vessel. An imponderable thing, this infatuation we have with wooden boats.
Haunting image. Sunlight, breakers smashing on a rocky west coast beach. And one of the eagles of the sea, as the Indians call them, skimming over the waves with incredible speed and grace. Not one of the slim, elegant birch bark craft of the inland waters, but a proud seagoing canoe, fashioned out of the magic wood of the red cedar for long journeys, the whale hunt, and war.
A fascinating story about the development of a canoe. From a hollowed log comes a wonderfully sophisticated form, slowly emerging into one of mankind's grandest designs.
Tradition can be servitude, but it can also be freedom when it enables you to do something better than anybody else. Canoe building on the northwest coast was one of the great traditions, a family affair full of professional tricks of the trade.
Like the crooked knife, a perfect fusion of the carver's hand, the tool he uses, and the wood he carves.
This unfinished tool is called an elbow adze. And you can see the very reason for that, since it's shaped like a human elbow. It is a tool that allows great leverage and a great cutting strength. It's quite different from our axe, but it's a truly wonderful idea. This tool is used by the Indians in many different sizes and shapes. You can see exactly how it came out of the tree and then was reversed by them. This would be a much larger one, but perfect for taking large chunks of material out of the center of the canoe or building a house or anything. A truly unique and wonderful instrument of mankind.
Here are tools that are thousands of years old. This Egyptian carpenter is working with the elbow adze, just like the one that Henry Hunt, one of our great native carvers, uses today.
The eye and the hand and the elbow adds, stripping away the layers, searching for whatever mystery there is to be found in the wood. It's soft, but of a wonderful firmness. Across the grain it cuts clean and precise. It is light in weight and of a wonderful reddish brown when new, silvery gray when old. You can build from the cedar tree the external trappings of one of the world's great cultures. That's what another great native artist said about cedar. His name is Bill Reed, goldsmith, sculptor, carver.
It comes in such a wide variety of textures and hardnesses and grain quality and all these things that you can find the right type for almost any problem you have. For these massive carvings on the coast, the red and yellow cedar are certainly ideal because they're soft and easy to cut. And when you get to smaller things, like this soapberry spoon I'm working on now, you need something a little harder, a little more honest as far as grain is concerned, so it won't split on you. And this is just alder, which is considered a weed. It's used a little bit for furniture construction and so on, but it's a beautiful wood. It's lovely and white, as you can see, when it's new, and it weathers to a lovely soft beige color, and it cuts nice and clean. It's not too hard, not too soft, and you can do all kinds of things with it.
The raven and the first men, the creation myth of the Indians of the Northwest Coast, carved appropriately in their own wood, the cedar.
Then if you want something really special that you can do anything you want with, this boxwood is the best. I haven't done too much with it. I made the original of the raven, and it's absolutely amazing stuff. You can do, if you have the skill and the eyesight, you can do almost anything you want with it. Smaller the scale, the better it likes it. And it's so hard. This is very thin, and I wasn't very careful with it. Dropped it and put too much pressure on it and all the rest of it. It doesn't break. It just comes up smiling every time. And it's oily. It gets this lovely patina. It's the finest carving material in the world, I think. I think you probably do feel this old ridiculous carver's mystique a little bit more with wood than you do with other things, because it has been a living thing in the very recent past, although I suppose stuff like ivory and bone is the same. Everybody, I think, who's ever carved particularly in organic form, really thinks that after a while, and in spite of his bias against such superstitious nonsense, that whatever you're looking for is in there someplace or another, and you peel the outer layers away, and eventually there it is. So you carve away until you have all those layers removed, and then you make sure that you shouldn't push it a little bit farther. And I think it's that final push that makes the difference in carving, that you build that little extra tension in, that little stretch the skin a little bit tighter over the animal or bird or whatever it is. And then you quit and hope that you really got whatever is in there fully exposed.
The sea, the trees, a rocky beach, and a boy and his grandfather carving wood together.
And it seemed to me that must have been pretty much the way it had been 100, 200,000 years ago in those villages, that kids would make their way from one part to another on the beach, and somebody would be making a canoe, or somebody would be carving a pole or carving a mast or leaving a net or doing something like that, and they'd stop and observe and talk and fool around with the tools, and in a very easy, unstructured way, they'd learn all there was to know about their universe. And be a wonderful way to get educated, I think.
The eagle soars in the summit of heaven, but he too will be caught and held by the carver's craft. Bill Kuchin also comes from a northern tradition, in his case Russian. He carves nature from nature, using the Indian technique of the crooked knife, passed on to him by his friend Bill Reed.
Because I could lever on it. I could go into a bowl and just use this as a lever.
Wonderful.
I think he was putting my knives down by sort of saying, "Oh, what a beautiful handle." But it works for me, particularly getting into a very deep sort of thing.
Now, how about the decoration of these bowls? I see one there where you're part way along with it.
Well, they started out as an imitation of the Russian traditional bowl, and I couldn't understand why in the shape. The shape appealed to me, but I didn't really understand where it came from until I cut the wood from scratch myself, and then I discovered that it fits beautifully into the log. So the formal shape really is what the log would impose on a piece.
This piece, what kind of wood is this? It's quite different.
This is birch. It's from northern BC, around Shuswap Lake.
This seems almost like that with a top on it. I mean, it's...
It is, yeah.
It is?
In fact, it's a box. They became from bowls to boxes,
wonderful.
That sort of thing.
And what kind of a catch have you there? I mean,
that's a little wooden catch with just a small spring there.
Right. I love sculpture that surprises you. Anyway, this you at first would not imagine that was a box. That's beautiful.
I'm trying to hide the divisions so that it fits in with the anatomy.
Right.
I really went into the catches in a big way after I started the Canada Goose series.
Oh,
this is
oh, I really like that. Look, isn't that an elaborate catch? The whole inside of this is beautiful, I think. Oh.
That's the way it works.
Love it. Look at this. This is my favorite, Bill. I love the way you've carved it. It isn't just that I like bald eagles, it's this particular one. Tell me, how did you do those wings and that beautiful head?
The eagle, I've been looking at them for quite a while. Just behind the house, there's a bunch of eagles nesting. Well, I started out with observing them. I looked at the way the American eagle, you know, the folk carvings.
Well, you've achieved that. I mean, it's halfway between a very realistic eagle, and it's somehow back to those other Russian forms that you've been doing, and yet somehow there's quite a change.
Well, they became gradually more realistic. They started out much more formally, because it was a formal concept, the peasant pieces of the Russian roosters. The eagle is from our neighborhood.
What are the sounds of wood? At its simplest, a tree can cry out in the wind as an eagle screams. At its most complex, the sound of a harpsichord. Lutes and viols, too, a source of beauty for the eye and for the ear. We build a very light framework of some kind of wood, and then we stretch strings across it. Does the tree sing yet in the wood? Stradivarius thought so as he listened to the pine trees outside Cremona. Today, in an isolated BC farmhouse, a man is building a harpsichord. The interest in old instruments, their performance, how they sound, it's all bound up intimately with the dialogue between the artist and his material. The mark of the maker, Edward Turner, factor. A pupil of Arthur Lismer, one of the last of the group of 7, his training as a draftsman has stood him in good stead. Since no one knows how harpsichords were built in the 17th and 18th century, the custodian of the Russell collection of antique instruments in Scotland asked Turner to provide some plans of his own. When, after centuries, the instruments were opened for restoration, Turner was able to make detailed scale drawings of what he found inside. From these, he was later able to design and build his own instruments. Although he doesn't play a note, Turner's harpsichords are known and used in the performance of Baroque music all over the world. Here, in shaping the soundboard, perhaps the most important part of the instrument, he uses ropes so as not to damage the wood. This sensitivity to his material is shared by his friend, the musician and lute maker Ray Nurse.
All of the instruments that I make are based pretty much on the early schools of building the traditional instruments, because the instrument was evolved over 5 or 6 centuries in Europe, and they evolved very strong schools of building. They certainly knew what they were doing, and I don't think so far anyone in this century has brought the instrument to the point of perfection that it was in the 16th and 17th centuries. So one can do really no better than to try to emulate the style of the early builders in this case. They're very lightweight, very economical instruments in terms of their structure. They, as I said, there's no reinforcement inside the back, so because the wood is very thin, it's extremely delicate like an eggshell, and yet it's tremendously strong because of the shape and because of the angles of the joins. And the front of the instrument is the same way. It's extremely thin and flexible, and it's only held up by very delicate bars inside. People are usually very surprised when they actually pick up the instrument to find out how light it is. It's about half the weight that you would imagine. And of course, this very thin wood and very light construction provides a tone which is very quick speaking from the instrument, and the whole instrument vibrates, of course, when you play. In fact, even when you're talking and holding an instrument, the sound of your voice will make the wood vibrate. It's so sensitive. In traditional instrument making, of course, one has to recognize certain types of wood and qualities of wood which are traditionally acceptable and which traditionally is a fine piece of wood. This is not always a piece of wood which is immediately appealing to the eye. In fact, the wood for the belly is very plain looking to most people's eyes, and one has to learn to recognize certain grain patterns and a certain fineness of the grain. And also a stiffness when you hold the wood, and this way of how flexible the wood is, a certain consistency, whether it's springy or soggy or strong or weak or so on. I think especially with lutes, because of the thinness of the material and the delicacy of the material, that one develops a kind of a delicate way of working on it. I don't really know of any lute makers, for example, who use power tools very much. It sort of brutalizes the material. It doesn't seem to be in keeping with the instrument. One has to, with such delicate materials, I think you have to spend a fair amount of time with your tools to make sure that they can cope. For example, as I said before, this is very soft wood and very delicate wood, and so that the tools that one uses have to be extremely sharp, and one has to be extremely careful in working with this. So one adapts the processes, in a sense, to suit the material all the time.
The Cistercian Monastery of Notre-Dame-de-Lac, Oka, Quebec. On Good Friday, 1982, the monks unveiled a new series of the Stations of the Cross. a visual recalling of the sufferings and crucifixion of Christ, conceived by a French-Canadian sculptor, carved by 14 art school students in red cedar, and a new vision of an eternal theme, the death and resurrection of a God.
All stations are different in techniques, but they are also different in the way they are conceived, because they go inside the subject to get only the essential idea of the station. And for instance, when we see Mary at the foot of the cross, we see only her, and it only evokes the feet of the cross. We don't even see the Christ, we see Mary.
It reminds us of the rising sun, and for those who have seen a rising sun, we remember how glorious it is, and it's a glorious Christ.
And it's made of wood, and it has to be made of wood because it recalls us of the cross of Christ, the cross that was in wood.
And when they came to Mara, they could not drink of the waters of Mara, for they were bitter. And he cried unto the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, and he cast it into the waters, and the waters were made sweet. In 1940, a London church was hit by German bombs during an air raid, and a superb altar screen, a masterpiece of the great 17th century woodcarver Gwynlyn Gibbons, was destroyed. The next day, the people of the parish searched through the smoking ruins and recovered some 2,000 separate pieces of wood. Today, the altarpiece of lime wood is restored. Flowers and fruit festoon the church once again, and together with the cherubs and the heraldic beasts, the unicorns and the lions celebrate in wood the triumph of life over death. A different vision, a different world. In Africa, the unrelenting sun allows no weakness. A market stool. The shadows and shining surfaces reveal themselves, but when the carver's knife bites into the wood, it's the light that decides. The ritual offering, the double cup. The memory of the sun hid in some dark wood. Her eyes gaze upon all things known, all things unknown, in triumph of intellect, with motionless head erect. They move. The wooden figures move in slow, hieratic patterns of the ritual dance. Wood through the ages has been part of the most intimate and sacred moments of man's life. In every sense of the word, we are touched by wood and we respond. The tree of life, It's a good phrase.
I've used the term calibrated Earth, or the title calibrated Earth for some of these, because the Earth is measured. I think it is. It's got certain limits that we have to recognize and appreciate, and the kinds of shapes that I'm using are as if we're looking back at the Earth from outer space. So it's not the usual way of looking at it, and very few people have experienced this directly. And I think most of us can only think about that as an idea, about looking back from outer space. And how do we think differently when you put yourself into that position? Do we see the world differently? So although these are very decorative surfaces, I think there are elements within them that end up being metaphors for something else.
A world without trees, a world without life. Wood makes us feel the age of the earth, the greatness of time and space and nature. For thousands of years we've carved it, used it, and abused it. It has provided us with warmth, food, and shelter, the means of life and death, of work and play. Wood is the healer, the most human of all materials, a substance with a soul.